Hello and welcome to the Good Grief Festival and to this event on how to have life-changing conversations with Dr. Kathryn Mannix. I'm Julia Samuel, a psychotherapist and author, and Kathryn and I are going to have this conversation for 30 minutes. And then we would love your questions and comments, which you can put in the comment box on the right of your screen for the last 15 minutes. So as we're talking, you're a wonderful community. Do please comment and ask your questions, and then we'll answer them at the end. Kathryn has written a wonderful book called Listen, which seems to be in a world that is constantly transmitting with a huge amount of noise, is particularly apt that we should have this book now. So Kathryn, please introduce yourself and tell us what kind of inspired you to write this wonderful book.
Thanks, Julia, and good morning, everybody. I'm a retired palliative care consultant, and I worked for 30 years in hospitals and hospices and, in people's own homes, having life-changing conversations with people, really. And so some people who are with us this morning will know that I wrote a book originally about the way people die and about understanding ordinary dying better, a book called With the End in Mind. And I thought that was it. I didn't see myself as a writer. I saw myself as a retired doctor who wrote a book. But then this correspondence started from people saying, okay, you've convinced us we need to talk about this stuff, but either I don't know where to start, I'm terrified I'm going to break something that will never be the same again, I don't want to upset people, or desperate people saying, I'm trying to have this conversation with my family and they keep closing me down, they don't want to talk about it. How do we do that? So I thought, well, I do have something to say about that. And I went to my publishers who've been so supportive and had wanted a second book and said, I think this might be a second book. And they said, oh, that's great, but we don't want another death book. Okay.
Not death again.
Not death again. So that was interesting. So obviously from my own life, from family and friendships, and from my cognitive therapy practice, I've got a whole slice of the world that isn't just about end-of-life conversations. So the things that we do that make conversations work are the same in all of those contexts. So although I think it's fairly obvious that I've worked in palliative care from this book, the examples, the stories are from across life's span.
And why do you understand? I mean, I'm sure you do, but why is it that we kind of, as you say, find it so difficult having what you call tender conversations? What are our fears around them? And also, what are tender conversations?
So I'm going to answer that the other way around, okay, because I think it kind of works. That I think because we feel anxious, because we feel the conversation's a job to be done, we do that thing of tensing up. We put on our guard, we take up our courage, we put on our armor, we're ready. And actually that, of course, is a really defensive way to go into any kind of conversation, whether it's with a person you know really well, somebody you love, or whether it's a professional conversation. So I started calling them tender conversations, in fact, at work, in response to advertisements for courses about courageous conversations or challenging conversations or difficult conversations, because I think the attitude we take into the conversation changes what happens next. And when I've been listening to people talking about their own reluctance to start a conversation of great importance, it's very often that they feel that in some way they're causing a damage, that if they name the difficulty that needs to be discussed, then there'll be emotions unleashed and it will be their fault, rather than this being something where the truth is the bitter truth, and what we're going to do is sit together with it in a sense of mutual support, I suppose. So it seems to me that tenderness, rather than having our loins girded, is the way to come into this.
So in a way, what you're saying is that our kind of attitude and feelings and intention, so if we are kind of armored and fearful because we have either this sense that we're breaking something or, making something bad by naming it, or we have a kind of magical thinking that I'm going to make it bad by naming it. What you're saying is if we kind of recognize that the truth is there and needs to be named, but if our attitude towards it is recognizing that this is painful and being sensitive to the pain, to the tenderness, like a kind of wound or a bruise, how we then begin the conversation is one that can be more easily received because we are less defended and more open.
I think it's exactly that. I think that we perceive with each other as we communicate whether the person is receiving us or is simply waiting to say their next thing. And we've all done that, haven't we? I know I've sat in meetings, big meetings at work, and somebody said something and I thought, when it's my turn to talk, I need to tackle that. And now I'm not really listening. I'm just waiting.
Rehearsing what I'm going to say.
Yeah, I'm honing the words down. So I think that by just being prepared to be present and not quite knowing what to say, people seem to feel, and in the correspondence and in the chats that I've had with people preparing for this book, it's really clear that people seem to think that people who manage these conversations well know what to say. And yet I'm sure that you as a psychotherapist, and I know that I as a doctor, but also as a family member or a friend, when we break open those conversations, we don't know what we're going to say. We know that we're going to listen thoroughly enough to understand, and some of the things that we say are simply the things that are checking and exploring what the other person is telling us. But when it is our turn to speak, what we will say will depend on what we've heard, and it will come to us. But humans have been conversing since they were tiny, and we don't need to rehearse stock phrases. We need to think about what needs to be communicated and then just allow the words to come.
So a bit like you and I talking now, I mean, I have kind of topics in mind that I want us to explore. But if I just went like a blunt instrument through each of my topics, that would be an exchange of words. And I think what you're talking about and what I'm trying to have with you is a kind of a collaborative dance where I'm listening, I'm letting you know that I've heard you, I bring something of my own in response to what I've heard, and then that expands our understanding. So let's look at the types of conversations that people find difficult, and maybe give me an example of how that might go, or what people find difficult, and also how you might help them do that.
So one of the things that is I've had lots of feedback about is trying to talk to our teenagers and our young adults who are making sense of the world and getting bruised in the process in the same way that we did when it was our turn. And it's really hard when you're a parent and you love somebody to watch them being bruised by the world. You want to fix it.
And protect them.
And just not let the world hurt them. Give them your wisdom. Don't let them make your mistakes. And of course, what they want is the freedom to experiment and to try out and to discover. So those two forces are absolutely in opposition. We are afraid that they will be hurt by their experimentation. And they are discovering the world. And we can go into that conversation on transmit mode and redefine the boundaries and tell them this and tell them that and tell them the other. And we know they're not listening. We can see from their body language that they're not listening, and the eyes are all over the place. And they'll go, whatevs. In fact, when my children were teenagers, there was a phrase that each of them only tried once on me, which was talk to the hand.
The face, listening.
Yeah. Whereas when we go into a conversation with one of our teens and say, how is it for you? What's interesting? What's going on? What are the tender points? When I was younger, I made mistakes about things, and then I felt silly and humiliated. And I realize now that I needn't have done. And I wonder how you feel and how are things going for you? Or those careers conversations where they're saying, oh, either I want to do this, and you think, oh, they're overreaching there. You know, I need to protect them. Let's rein that in. No, let's support them. Let's see how far that reach can take them. Or they don't see themselves as talented enough and they're underselling themselves. And that conversation that says, well, tell me what you're interested in. Tell me what you're good at. You know, what could you do?
I mean, what I'm getting is that you don't come in with answers or views or opinions, although sometimes that might be useful. By listening, you really mean to step into that person's world, to kind of try and help them by listening to make sense of their world, so they can have some clarity for themselves about what they want to do in the future, about what they're confused about at school, with the boyfriend they're having a difficult time with. And that when you want to protect you know, your teenagers or your parents maybe, or whoever it is, you somehow block exploration, because in the protection you armor and you build a wall between each other. Yeah. So it's daring not to know.
Absolutely. And it's daring not to know, and to bring, instead of armor, to bring curiosity.
Yes,
isn't it? Word. Let's be curious. What is it like to be you? So another one of those awkward conversations is with our bereaved friend, our bereaved colleague, our bereaved family member. And isn't it bumpy when we're both bereaved of the same person, but we're processing our bereavement in different ways. Yeah. To just bring our curiosity into that conversation. How is it for you? How have you been? Because what we're helping somebody to do, I think, is as they try to marshal their thoughts to say them out loud, what they're doing is listening to themselves.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. Because we've all had that 3 o'clock in the morning thing, haven't we, where it's just soup, it's all going round in your head.
Pounding heart.
Awful. Yeah. And you just can't make sense of it. You can't work out how you're ever going to sort out this problem. And in daylight, it somehow doesn't seem quite so bad, but you still can't work it out. But when some kind person sits down and says, just tell me about it, now you can only say it one sentence at a time. And so by our listening, what we're allowing this person to do is tell their story. And as they tell it, they sometimes say, oh, and a bit that I left out is, and they'll go back in time to slot that bit in. And what they're doing really is they're building the jigsaw as the bits come out. And they're starting to see the picture of it as well. So our curiosity, our patience at allowing them to describe it, allows them also to experience it, and to experience it in a safe way. One of the things I used to really love as a cognitive therapist was to sit with somebody who was describing something that for them was very, very difficult, gave them enormous anxiety or very deep sorrow, caused them enormous rage, very strong emotions. And by us sitting together to think about the situation they'd experienced that they were describing, they were able now to kind of step slightly outside it with me. And we were both together looking at the situation. And now they could talk about it and describe it without being immersed in those really difficult emotions. And now they were able to start to make sense of it.
In a way, you're saying lots of different incredibly important things, that on the one hand, by being heard with curiosity and interest and compassion, you find all the different pieces of the jigsaw in yourself and all of those different feelings. And so you begin to have a coherent narrative of what you're feeling, what you're thinking, and making sense of it for yourself, which you can't do in your own head, because in your own head, you kind of get lost in lots of feelings. But also what seems really important is that by accompanying someone, by being beside them with these difficult conversations, and this could be talking to someone, it could be your mum and dad about their dying, that they've been given a diagnosis that they're, you know, that the end is in sight, their death is they're going to die, is that you can be beside them and look at it. So you can move in and out of the depth of feeling and then have some sort of more third eye observing and understanding.
Yeah, absolutely right. And so that idea of being somebody's companion, you know, we're not trying to be their therapist. Well, sometimes you and I are trying to be their therapist, and the skill set is the same. But actually,
not in my family. If I try and be a therapist with any member of my family, they literally want to shoot me. So
no, you're absolutely right. We cannot be therapists at home. But even in a therapy session, that kind of preparedness to be somebody's companion in their distress is the same, isn't it? And you talked before about the dance, and that's a metaphor that I've used through the book. When I reread the proposal this week because I was going to send it to somebody else who's trying to write a book proposal. And I knew that when I'd started off, I'd had the concept of a toolkit for these conversations, but I'd forgotten that it was still at the stage of being called a toolkit when I sent in the proposal. And of course, a toolkit is you pick up one tool and you use it, and then you put it down, and then you pick up the next one. And I was trying to find a metaphor for something that you do, and then you layer something else onto that, and then you might add something else in for a while and then back out again. And in fact, it was my brother who suggested, isn't this a little bit like dance? So I owe him a great debt because it was a metaphor that worked really beautifully for these conversations. Partly because it's great at talking about layering, and partly because it brings us back to ourselves as human beings with these innate abilities. So in the same way that you will see little children moving to the rhythm of a piece of music, and that we can move to the rhythm, we can start to move our feet, we can agree to try and dance with each other, and we're agreeing to cooperate, but then we tread on each other and we didn't mean to. It's a great metaphor for this conversation where we're really, really trying, and we all can converse, and we will make mistakes, kind of trip each other up, but we didn't mean to, and we know that we didn't mean to, and we forgive and we move on. So there's something about having confidence in each other, isn't there, during the conversation?
Well, I guess if you recognize that you don't have to come in with answers, and the person speaking, and you've taken turns, has confidence that they're going to be heard, you build trust. And when you build trust, you can allow for the missteps, for the misunderstandings, for the kind of things that go wrong. But also I was thinking, and you talk about this in your book, sometimes there are real breaches and conflicts and enormous difficulties, and you talk about it as building bridges. So we so far we've talked about sort of enough good intention between each other that you can have the dance and the move in and out and overcome them. What about where they're in families often, particularly around, well, not particularly, but in my world, around a death, you know, pre-existing fault lines get absolutely kind of imploded around a death, and there can be huge arguments and name calling and fury and upset, a lot of it from what's happened, but actually spat at each other.
Terribly difficult, isn't it?
Come on, fix this one.
And yeah, so I think we need to say this is really hard. This is really hard, and it's hard because it's hard anyway, and it's hard because if it's your family, you're grieving.
You're in it.
Yeah. So one of the things for us to think about is whether sometimes it's helpful to have a wise and trusted outsider, and very often we have family friends who can act as people in front of whom we might not display some of those behaviors that we would without them. But it's also thinking about these different people in our family and their intentions to each other. And one of the stories in the book is about sisters where they clearly love each other very much, but one of them has a kind of life value that being kind is the most important thing, and the other has a life value that being fair is the most important thing. And they're both great values. But gradually over their lives, they've started to drift apart because the kind default person is a kind of over-giver. And the fair default person,
that doesn't go with being
just
fair.
let them do that.
Yeah.
So you can see, if you just take the time to sit back, how people's good intentions can lead to those breaches. We needn't always infer that it's been bad intentions. And so going back into curiosity to try to work out if we were going to start again from here and build our relationships around the fact that this person we all love has died, that we are all grieving, that we need to perhaps sort out the estate together, things like that.
About money, isn't it? It's exchange for love, really.
Yeah. How can we be with each other, and how can we formulate that? But if you don't name it, if you're just walking on eggshells with each other all the time, it remains difficult. And perhaps to be able to have the courage to say, or the vulnerability to say, I know we all want this to work. I know we're all going to have different ideas about how to make it work. Shall we start to talk about how we could make it work? And let's be honest with each other about things that we as individuals might find difficult. Let's try and find the best way, or at least let's try and agree the least bad way to deal with each other around this. Often these conflicts go on festering just because nobody's named them.
And that does make sense, isn't it? That when you can name something, it takes some of its invisible power and toxicity away. Like, we are all fighting, we're disagreeing, we're hurting each other, we're all suffering, we're all in pain. And we all want to have a better conversation or a better outcome, or get on better and resolve this. So just doing that kind of puts your hand out, but it's not fixing, is it? It's not saying, well, we've got to sit down and do this, we've got to do that. Because I think people often when the people are suffering, because they feel so powerless, they often want to have control. And then, of course, that causes, like, no way are you, my younger sister or brother or whoever, going to be controlling me.
Yeah. And that fixing thing it's almost like so the enemy strong of listening, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we all do it a little bit. You know that just in an everyday conversation, somebody's telling you something and you think, I know how to fix that. And one of the things that I really love doing, and people who are listening to us might enjoy having a go at this, when I'm teaching listening skills, I get people to work in pairs and bring a little conundrum, nothing major, nothing emotional, because it's the other person practicing that's important here. We're not here for therapy to sort out your little conundrum. So, difficulty choosing a gift for somebody, or finding a family activity that everybody can enjoy, that level of conundrum. And the task is that the people in pairs have to listen to each other. And they're allowed to and encouraged to ask questions that clarify what they're hearing the other person say, and to do what I call a waltz. So every 2 questions is followed by a summary or a statement of some sort, just to check that I'm still on the same page, that I'm understanding you.
Yeah.
And so they're allowed to do this for 10 minutes, and then they change sides and the other person listens. And there's lots of giggling going on in the room, lots of laughing, hands being slapped about. And at the end, we say, okay, so who felt that they wanted to give advice? Because they've been forbidden to give advice. Everybody puts their hand up. And who actually gave advice? A few people put their hands up. And then the important debrief is who felt it was really artificial to be thinking about question, summary. And about 3/4 of the room will say, yes, that felt like a very artificial thing to do. And then, okay, so when you were being listened to, did it feel artificial? Absolutely not. And what's happened is by being given 10 minutes of being listened to and exploring the idea that you're trying to solve, most people have reached a solution or they've decided a next step. So we don't have to fix. We have to hold a space where the person assembles their jigsaw. And sometimes, of course, when you've finished a jigsaw, there are pieces missing and you haven't noticed until now. So when you're listening to your friend and all that they tell you about is how somebody else was behaving, you might be curious about how they felt about that or how they behaved in return or whatever. So you're spotting the missing pieces and asking the questions that help them to get a whole big picture. And now they're as intelligent as we are. They will see what can be done next and understand the next steps.
So interesting how we can undervalue the importance of opening the space and how we don't recognize the power of that, and that in being heard, you feel more confident, you feel more solution focused yourself, the more opportunity to repair, to have hope, all sorts of things when you're given the space for yourself. I mean, I could go down that route and talk for hours, but we've only got a few minutes before we want our lovely audience who've got questions. So on the kind of other side of the coin for speaking and listening, talk to me a bit about silence, the power of silence, the importance of silence, our discomfort with silence.
Oh, goodness, aren't we uncomfortable with silence? And in the silence, all that clanging, echoing of, this is uncomfortable. This looks like I don't know what to say. I'm not sure I do know what to say. Oh my goodness, beam me up, Scotty, this is terrible. And yet silence is the place where all the work happens, where the person that we're trying to help is listening to themselves, where they're processing, where they're deciding, where they're changing their mind. And if we just completely drown out the silence by asking more questions or by reassuring, or by offering our fixes. Yeah, and we are almost removing the space in which any kind of progress can be made. So silence is a really precious part of these tender conversations, and to see ourselves as companions rather than solvers. So if we're sitting quietly together now, that's what we're doing. We're not doing nothing, we're doing something. We are sitting together in silence. And during COVID, this has become particularly poignant and important because it's often been on the telephone. So when we're sitting in silence together in a room and you're sorrowful, and I can hand you a tissue, I can touch your shoulder or touch your hand, I can just move my body to say, yeah, I'm still here. And so on the phone, we need to find ways of doing that, of being able to say little things that don't require effort by the other person to listen to us because they're in that space of thinking, and just saying, take your time, I'm still here, it's okay, I'm listening. And even that fib, I've got plenty of time, because actually the less we interrupt, in fact, the less time eventually this will take, because the person will have the space to do their thinking. It's been a real challenge over the last 18 months to be that person's supporter when we can't be together.
And what I get in a way is many things, but one of them is, in order to have very difficult, challenging, painful conversations, being aware in ourselves of suffering, or our dying or parent dying, the intensity of that emotion is so strong. When we're accompanied, it allows us to feel safer, maybe, and safer in our bodies, safer in our mind, less frightened, because we have the warmth and the love of someone beside us who is daring with us to dare to face the things that we know are there, but we're scared to look at on our own. It's too difficult on our own. So in some ways, it's the love and connection of someone else in their presence, not in their words, and in their belief in us that we can do this, that helps us believe in ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully put. So basically, we are enabling, and that the work is being done by the other person. So our curiosity and our kindness are necessary. They're not always sufficient. Some people are going to go on to need specialist support and help, but maybe they can discover that by daring to look at their own suffering with us now and realize that maybe part of their solution is to find specialist help for their distress. But you know, the person who's found a lump, the person who's having thoughts of self-harm, that we can turn towards them and be supportive of them. But part of our support might be to offer to be their companion as they go to get the help that they need that we can't provide.
I mean, that's perfect. So I'm moving us away now to getting out of your depth. It seems there could be a fine line between a tender conversation and actual therapy. Is there a danger of getting out of your depth? And when do you know how far to take a conversation? So I imagine this is obviously someone who isn't a therapist. I can totally see the question, like, now I've been listening, now I'm not a therapist, I'm not qualified to do this.
Yeah. So I think part of that companionship and honesty is to check at the end, how are you feeling now? Because I felt so worried about the strength of your feelings there. Do you think that you need somebody who can help more than I can help? You know, trust your own gut.
Limits.
And in fact, I'm a little bit more worried about people who don't feel that perhaps they don't have enough, and the person who doesn't start to help somebody to get the help that they might need. So the fact that you're feeling a little bit anxious about this is absolutely fine to contribute into the conversation. You know, I'm so honoured that you've told me all of this, and I had no idea that the feelings that you had were so strong and so difficult. Thank you for telling me. I feel a little bit worried about whether you're really safe, and I wonder whether it would be helpful for you if we go together and find some other help. What do you think? Who would you trust? How can I support you? So it's still the other person's got
naming
control.
It again.
It is. Yeah. It's saying, you know, I am concerned, and my concern is that I'm out of my depth here. Why not say that? I'm very happy to listen. I'm really honoured to listen, but I'm not sure me listening is quite enough.
Yeah, you might need something more. Let's look at that together. Timing. Is there a wrong time to have a life-changing conversation, straight dance? These are all great questions.
Great question. So one of the things that I've talked about in the dance metaphor in the book is the invitation. That a lot of people seem to feel that we need to have this conversation, and we need to begin it, have it, finish it, execute it perfectly, and it's done in one sitting. And the real difficulty then is, you know, there's this conversation you need to have. You're going to break up with your boyfriend. You're going to tell your family some difficult news. You're going to ask your friend why she's been so bad-tempered recently. But the moment whereas in fact, if we simply have this little tiny conversation that says, I've got something on my mind that I'd really like to chat to you about at a time that you feel okay to chat about it too.
So you prep them and set a time together.
Because it's not fair for you to come in prepped and them to be completely cold, is it? So if we come upon somebody who's in a moment of deep distress, they already know what's going on. We can offer, but they can decline. It has to be an invitation, doesn't it? It has to be by mutual consent. And the invitation might lead into the conversation, or the invitation might lead into an arrangement to have the conversation. And that works in reverse as well. When somebody says, oh, I absolutely have to talk to you about X, and you know you've got to do the school run in 20 minutes, it's absolutely fine to say, that's really important. Thank you. I would love to talk to you about that. I've actually only got 15 minutes now, and then I'll be late for doing school pickup. If you think that's enough, I'm yours. But if that's not enough, should we arrange a phone call? Should we meet? When would be a good time? Do you want to text me? Sometimes you're available, I'll let you know. So that we are meeting at a pre-arranged time by mutual consent in a safe place.
And when you're emotionally and available, not thinking, how am I going to get out the door and do the school run? Mm. When people can't communicate with words, hang on, I've just made the thing go so fast down, I haven't got it, sorry. My husband had a brain tumor that caused extreme aphasia. It's difficult to have conversations when you literally can't find the words or understand other people's words. So how do we have conversations with people who are no longer able to join in without infantilizing them or talking over them or ignoring them?
Oh, isn't that incredibly difficult?
So
Thank you for
painful.
telling us that. So difficult. So I'm going to start by saying I think I probably don't know the answer. But part of the answer will be that people who have lost speech because of aphasia for a variety of reasons will usually have the support of a speech and language therapist. And if they have enough language left to be able to communicate, even just yes or no, stop and go, it's okay to continue or we need to stop, then we can begin to offer questions for yes, no answers. I've certainly had very profound conversations with people who are using eye movements to spell their responses, and obviously that takes a lot of time, and that can be difficult too. There are people who are using different languages, people who are using sign language, for example, and people using sign languages. It's a different language. It's not English with signs. The grammar, the syntax is completely different, but their natural reading of people's body language is often highly, highly honed. We're telling them much more than we tell people who don't use sign language simply by our facial expressions and body positions. They're wonderful people to have conversations with. But that idea of not infantilizing is so important, and it's about the way we bring ourselves into the conversation, isn't it? And a similar thing happens when we're trying to talk to elderly relatives and friends about their wishes and preferences about care or future healthcare interventions or whatever. We can infantilize them by saying, well, come on now, Dad, because I really want to know the answers. I'm going to have to make decisions in the future. Whereas, in fact, when we go to that person who has had parental responsibility for us and keep them as a parent, Dad, I'm concerned in the future there may be things I'm going to have to decide or represent you. You've made me your attorney. So I need your guidance now to get it right for you. So he's in charge. He's still Dad. And for that person who's lost language to be saying, I'm trying very hard
to understand you,
to use what I know of you, to understand what you're trying to say, and I will carry on doing my best to understand and to not take over. And just, we may need to say, and sometimes you may need to forgive me because I have taken over. And I'm sorry when that has to happen. But that's so difficult. That's a really, really difficult situation.
Really. But I think, again, what you're saying is kind of naming it and not being patronizing. And, that 70% of communication is nonverbal. So by how you look in your face, your body language, and then finding ways of communicating as openly as you can, whether it's with eye movement or with a speech and language therapist, or slowly with your parent. It's the collaboration, the quality of their importance that is really important to maintain. The other person, what if the other person doesn't play their part, doesn't listen to you as much as you listen to them? So like she has a bad boyfriend who didn't listen to her, didn't want to hear what she had to say. We had a couple of bad arguments. He slammed the conversation shut. I don't believe it. I don't want to talk about it. And so if someone is constantly shutting the door in your face, how do you manage that?
Oh gosh, that's hard, isn't it? So yeah. I think that's a conversation about conversations. Perhaps we need to work out how to have
when you're not in the heat of the fight.
Absolutely.
So after, like 2 days later or whatever.
Yeah. So that's the invitation. I don't want to talk about the thing we were talking about that we fell out about. I want to talk about how we communicate with each other. When would be a good time to do that? And then to be able to say to people, not what you did wrong, but the things that you do that help me to feel relaxed and listened to when we are conversing, because I bet sometimes they do it well. So let's positive feedback. Nothing succeeds like praise. To be able to tell somebody these are the things that they do, and sometimes when I know when I don't feel heard, maybe I start to talk louder and faster.
Get bossy.
Oh, yeah. So maybe we need some signals that we're going off piste. But it comes down again, doesn't it, to that naming and being prepared to be somebody's companion in finding it out. Let's be curious about
why do you find it so difficult? What scares you?
Yeah. How do you like to be spoken to? What is it that I'm doing that makes you feel defensive? And would it be okay if I describe to you how I like to be spoken to and the things that make me feel safe and the things that stop me from feeling safe? And maybe we can have some practices.
Fantastic. Sharing your own experience. How appropriate is it to share your own experience when you're talking to when you're talking to wanting to show empathy?
Oh, that's really good, isn't it?
The frame of the relationship, whether you're professional or friendship.
Yeah, there's a danger, isn't there, in saying, "Oh, exactly the same thing happened to me.
I know how you feel."
and now we're no longer centered on that person. So I think that it can be helpful when somebody's struggling with something and they're a little bit embarrassed that they're struggling, to share that we've been embarrassed in the past to be found to be not very good at something, or to have struggled with something, or one of the things about parenting is that every other parent is a perfect parent of perfect children.
My friend's mum.
Yeah. Or I'm the only parent in the world whose children have struggled. So when somebody else is describing their children's struggle and their struggle in parenting that, to be able to say, well, it hasn't all been plain sailing in our house either. So I've got some
that's a nice
inkling. Yeah. I've got some inkling of what you're talking about, but tell me more about your situation. We don't now go into the full diatribe about how difficult it was for me. But so I think a little bit of sharing is very helpful, because it starts to scaffold that trust that you were talking about before.
Yeah. And it's a kind of in some ways, sharing, you open the door to things that are often very private, that build intimacy and trust, but without then taking over and it being my full diatribe about my teenage daughter and her boyfriend's or eating disorder or whatever it was. Kathryn, there are many, many questions, because you raise such an incredibly important and valuable and precious topic and conversation, the capacity to listen and how we build trust in our relationships by listening and talking, and how we do it in a way that helps us overcome enormous difficulties. And so, although this is a very short conversation, I hope it's a beginning conversation for this wonderful Good Grief community that are listening to us in silence. They only have a few words in the chat box, but to thank all of you for coming and listening. And you can find Kathryn on Instagram to continue the conversation. You can find her book anywhere where you can buy a book. You can find me on Instagram. So I hope the conversation and the capacity to listen continues in all of you as your days and weeks go forward, and that this is the beginning of an understanding. And thank you, Kathryn, for your enormous compassion, wisdom, love and warmth. You're very special.
Julia, thank you so much. Lovely to talk to you as always. Thank you. I felt really safe. That was wonderful listening. Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you, everyone who's listening. And we'll be in touch. Bye.